Hello everybody, welcome back to High Ground. My name is Tanner, and today we're going to be going over power rankings for North America Rainbow Six Siege, stage number 2 of 2024. We are 4 playdays into the round robin phase of the stage, so a little bit less than halfway through, but then there's also playoffs and LCQ at the end, so in the grand scheme of things, we're maybe like a third of the way through the stage, give or take. So not a great ways in, but I didn't do a power ranking before the stage, so I'd rather do one a little bit earlier, and so we can talk about where teams were before and where after what we've seen so far, which again is still pretty limited, where I'd rank them now. So before stage number 2, this is the power ranking as I saw it. I didn't do an official one, so this is a little bit retroactive, but it's what we're going to go with. In 9th place, Los, they did have some really major improvements. They dropped 2 sort of dud players and brought in 2 really experienced players with a lot of promise. And so I think in terms of just raw improvement, they might have been the most improved team, but the bar was very, very low from where they started, and we still need to see them prove that they are not the worst team. It's entirely possible, but again, we've seen the other teams all play a lot more in the offseason, so I'm going to keep Los in last place for now. And then we have Wildcard, and they've been pretty unimpressive. Them and Oxygen both have had some unfortunate showings in the offseason. I think you'd probably say Oxygen even a little bit more than Wildcard. And that might just be a matter of perspective, because Oxygen not too long ago was one of the higher up teams in the league. Even last stage in best of ones, they did pretty well, and then they just didn't make the major. Wildcard has just been mid for like eternity, so maybe it's just a matter of expectations. I'm going to put Oxygen slightly higher than Wildcard. Then we have Luminosity, and this also feels pretty interchangeable. Honestly, 6 through 9, I could see a lot of different orders for this. Luminosity, I would put them clearly at number 6 if they still had Surf. I did still obviously put them at number 6, but it's not as clear now because they got Surf onto the roster. They played the EWC qualifiers, then they made it to the event, and they weren't horrible, but they weren't great at the event. Still, they were one of the 3 North American teams to qualify, but then they lose Surf, who, I think a lot of people would probably say was their best player, and obviously a key reason they were able to qualify for their first international event. That was also Surf's first international event, so, credit all around. But still, having to bring in Woos, not quite last minute, but pretty late into the game, I think keeps them from being a clear number 6. But again, here they are anyways. And then we have, I think, a pretty wide gap. I think it comes down to like the top 5 teams in North America and then the bottom 4 teams. I would be fairly surprised to see any of these bottom 4 teams qualify for the major, but I think it's still possible. We could see a Luminosity, we could see like an Oxygen Resurgence, we could see Los finally be good. Like we could see any of these teams maybe slide in, but I would expect it to be 4 of these 5 top teams. So Dark Zero, I put at the bottom here. Had they not made any roster changes and they didn't have the whole Canadian debacle, I think I'd have them at number 1 or number 2, but there's not really a change that you can make within North America larger than losing Canadian. Like that is just such a big thing for your team's identity and its structure, and they still have great players. Kobe Lax is a really exciting pickup. They've looked reasonable so far. They're one of the teams that have only played 3. Do keep that in mind. 5 of these teams, and I'll show you the matchups that have already happened. 5 of these teams had played 4 best of ones, and then the other 4 teams have only played 3. Dark Zero is one of the teams that have only played 3. So by losing Canadian, again, even though they have good players, I'm going to put them down here. It feels like maybe the team with the most question marks, along with Sonics, who I put slightly above them. They've looked really good so far. Going to talk about that a little bit more coming up, but they weren't great last stage. But adding Canadian onto any team, especially a team with as solid of players as Sonics has, and then bringing on Surf as well, I think a lot of promise, but I didn't want to put them higher than number 4 until they really prove themselves. Then we have M80 here. And, they were really good in North America last stage, and then they were one of the better performing North America teams at the major. They made it in top 8, and then they failed to qualify for EWC. They replaced Noodle with Hyper, and maybe an upgrade, maybe a side grade. Maybe you think Hyper's washed. We still need to see a little bit more before we really determine that. I wouldn't say he's washed, but is he going to be a phenomenal pickup or not? So I'm going to put them here because they've been generally pretty solid. And again, these 2 teams I put below them have a lot of question marks attached to them. Then we have Space Station, who also made a roster change. All of these teams between stages 1 and 2, they made roster changes. But Space Station, they solidified theirs a while ago. They picked up Benja Master. They played and qualified for EWC. And then they also played in some off-season tournaments. So they have a lot of reps. M80, Hyper's really new. Sonics, Canadian and Surf are really new. Dark Zero, Kobe Lax is really new. And then Benjamaster's still fairly new, but a lot less new than these other guys. So I'm going to put them here. They've been consistently pretty good. They had a poor showing in Manchester, but they replaced the main reason that happened, the whole iconic situation. And then Cloud9 Beast Coast. I think there are a lot of reasons to put them in first place. I mean, not least of which the fact that they won the league last stage and then they won the major, but they weren't at EWC. Part of that I would really attribute to the Mickey Mouse qualifier format, and that might actually help them because pretty much every team ever, whenever they win a championship, they go on a bit of a slump. So maybe they've managed to avoid that by having that really lengthy offseason. Again, there was EWC, but that's an unofficial thing. So we'll see if they're back and completely ready to play in the remainder of their games, because they've only played like a third of their games. Okay, so that's enough talk about that. Oh, one more thing. Yeah, these guys didn't make roster changes, but they did change orgs, which is, a change, but they also changed their staff. They lost their coach and analyst, and they got a new one. So that is a change, even if it's not a playing roster change. Okay, let's move on. And 1 second before we get to the actual power rankings, these are the standings right now. Again, keep in mind, Cloud9 Beast Coast, Dark Zero, Los, and Oxygen have all only played 3 best of ones. They've already had their bye days, whereas the other teams have all played 4. So Oxygen, even though they're in last, they have the potential for 3 more points within their first 4 games. And like Cloud9 Beast Coast, they're in 3rd, but if they get the full 3 points from their next game, they'll actually be the best team throughout the first 4 games. So, those are just a few factors to consider. And then these are the matchups that have already happened. I'll slow down for just 1 second. Feel free to pause and take a look at these. You can also go on Liquipedia and take a little bit of a cleaner look at these if you want. But I will be sort of referring back to these, but I'm not going to show this on screen again. All right, without further ado, let's talk about the current power rankings as I see them. At the bottom, we have Wildcard, and I think it's really a debate between Wildcard and Oxygen. I think a lot of people would immediately say Oxygen, and Oxygen is at the bottom of the standings, and they did just lose to Wildcard. So, they have the fewest points. Wildcard has the head-to-head over them. But again, as I mentioned earlier, Oxygen has an additional game to play. Wildcard has already lost 3 games in regulation, whereas Oxygen have lost 3 games, but one of them was in overtime. So they have the potential to win a game, whether that be in overtime or regulation, and they would surpass Wildcard within the first 4 games. Oxygen also has a better round differential, -7 versus Wildcard's -8. So I think if you ignore the head-to-head and you look at other factors, I'm going to give it to Oxygen. Wildcard, in their most recent showing, it was against Cloud9 Beast Coast, who look really good, but they got crushed 7-2. So all things considered, I'm going to give it to Oxygen. Another factor, Oxygen did lose to Wildcard again, but they sort of choked that one, which you might consider even worse for Oxygen. But when games are choked early in the stage, I'm going to give teams a little bit more of a break. We're going to say the same thing when we talk about Sonics. You're really trying to solidify yourselves. I think Oxygen have a bit less of an excuse because they've had the same 5-man roster for a lot longer than Sonics have. But anyways, they looked pretty well in control of that game for the first 10 rounds, and then they lost 4 rounds in a row and lost the game. I'm going to give it to Oxygen, but still they're going to be here at number 8. So those are the bottom 2. And then we have Los, and they haven't been great, but I don't think they've been quite as bad as these 2 other teams. Honestly though, I could see any order for these 3. I wouldn't be mad if you had Los, Oxygen, or Wildcard in any of these 3 positions. Los, they're 1 and 2, so yeah, we've only seen the 3 games from them. They're -4. They fairly solidly lost the 2 games they did lose, losing up against, who was it? Luminosity, who they lost 7-3 against, and they lost to Dark Zero 7-4, and they beat Oxygen also 7-4. So they beat the team right below them fairly handily. They lost to 2 teams that I'm gonna put above them. I think this is a fine placement for them. Again, I could see a case for them being lower, but this is the positioning that I'm most happy with. And then we have Luminosity, who I think clearly better than these teams. They have more points, and another point for Luminosity, I didn't really address this earlier. They were probably one of the better teams last stage, just in general. They played fairly well in best of ones, and then they were pretty, they were close-ish to making the major. I can't remember. I think they might have fell in the semis of the LCQ, but they had their moments here and there. I think, and they also have more excuses being a less experienced team. Lots and lots of experience split among these three teams, especially with Los picking up those more experienced players. So I think all things considered, I really feel like Luminosity deserves this 6th place spot, which is actually where I had them before. The order for these 3 have switched up a little bit. Let me talk about them a little bit more. They lost to Cloud9 Beast Coast, and they lost up against, who was the other one? They beat M80, they beat Los, and they lost to SSG. So two of the two of the higher up teams they lost to, and then they got, you know, wins against Los solidly and up against M80, which is also a good one. So I'm going to have them here at 6. I think that's a fine position for them. Then we have M80, who, you know, it always looks a little bit strange when you have a team that lost the head-to-head and it's this close right above them, but I'm going to go with M80 here. Had I done power rankings after day number 3 versus day number 4, I'd probably have M80 like a spot, 2 spots, 3, I don't know, several spots higher probably, because they were looking pretty solid through the first 3 days, and then they kind of got mopped by LG in the most recent play day, losing 7-3. They beat Cloud9 Beast Coast on the first day 8-6, so a close one, but they still got the win. They beat Wildcard 7-4. I think that's actually the same scoreline they had against them last stage on the very first play day, and they lost to Sonics. So you know, losing to Sonics, again, one of the higher up teams, not so bad, but losing to Luminosity, not great. I don't think I can really put M80 any higher than this at the moment. You know, there might, again, even be an argument to switch these two, but this is what I want to rock with here. Then we have Dark Zero next up. Only seen 3 games from these guys. They looked really bad in the first one. They got smoked by Sonics, which was a real statement game because, of course, Dark Zero just dropped Canadian, who went over to Sonics, and so, you know, Canadian really getting his revenge there. But they've looked pretty good in the following 2 games. They beat SSG 7-4, and they beat Los 7-4, so pretty reasonable stuff. Anyways, Dark Zero showing a lot of promise. I'm going to need to see a few more games from them before I can put them any higher, but I do think they certainly have the potential to go to 1st, 2nd, or 3rd as we see more of the stage progress. Next up, I have Space Station, and yeah, I feel like the way things are panning out at the moment with the limited number of games we've seen, the standings feel fairly static to me. Again, like I said, I could see the bottom switching around a bit, but I feel like these 4, this feels really right to me. I didn't have to debate much on this 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th. This is what I feel happy with at the moment. But Space Station was very close to being much lower. They beat Sonics 8-6, but they were down 6-3. They had to win 5 rounds in a row to close it out. So really impressive stuff by Space Station, and I'd say it was even more of a choke on Sonic's end. As I was alluding to earlier, I'll give Sonics a pass for that one because, you know, they did just undergo some pretty massive roster changes. Not only did Canadian join the team, Surf join the team, but their coach went from Goddess to Super, so even an additional change. So a lot of kinks being worked out. Sonics still look very, very good. I'm going to say that it was also impressive that they went up 6-3. Had they not sort of let things slip, they probably coulda, shoulda, woulda won that game pretty decisively, at least in regulation, 7-3, 7-4, 7-5, whatever the case. On one hand, good on Sonics for controlling the first 9 rounds of the game pretty well, and then on the other hand, good for Space Station to win 5 rounds in a row to secure 2 of the 3 possible points. And yeah, I think this is the one that I would deliberate the most. This is the most interesting conversation to me, is Cloud9 versus Sonics for number 1. I'm putting Cloud9 Beast Coast at number 2, but it's extremely close. I think by the numbers, Cloud9 probably deserved number 1. Again, they are the reigning major champions, not talking about EWC and whatever. And Sonics still have a lot to prove. They were pretty mid for the last little while, and these guys prove that they are the real deal, Cloud9 Beast Coast. But I've just been a little bit more impressed by Sonics, and maybe that's a result of expectations, but that's how I want to place them. Talking a little bit about the results, and I think the main thing for me that tie broke them is the teams that they've played against and the scores that those games have come. So they've each taken a 6-8 loss. Cloud9 Beast Coast was up against M80, whereas Sonics was against Space Station, and I do have Space Station higher than M80, and they've each handed out a pretty big beating, 7-2, with Cloud9 Beast Coast coming over Wildcard and Sonics coming over Dark Zero, and I also have Dark Zero higher than Wildcard. So because those matches came at identical scorelines and Sonics results were both against higher ranked teams on the list, that was the main tie-breaking factor for me. So yeah, Sonics at number 1. Okay, that's gonna do it for my list, and let me know what you think. Again, I think these 3 can kind of be switched around. Maybe you swap these 2, maybe you swap these 2, and I guess maybe even these 2. Dark Zero does have the head-to-head over Space Station, to be fair. Again, do let me know what you think. I would love to hear if you have any drastically different opinions from mine, like if you think M80 is way down here, or if you think Luminosity is way up here, etc., etc. I would love to hear that kind of thing, and that's going to do it for me. Catch you guys next time.